conference with Professor Christopher Yeomans with the topic Hegel on the social basis of the political. Before introducing Professor Yeomans, I have to say that we will have a musical concert downstairs, and after that we have for the associates in the Ibero-American Hegel Society, we will have a meeting here. So those who want to listen to the music can go downstairs and then come back, okay? So I'll briefly present Professor Yeomans. I'm sorry, pronunciation, right?
Yeomans.
Yeomans.
Close enough.
Okay. Christopher Yeomans received his PhD at the University of California, Riverside in 2005. He began his academic career at the University of California, Berkeley, where he studied primarily linguistics, literature, and literary theory. Eventually, literary theory led him to critical theory and then to the classical German philosophy that serves as its foundation. After a dissertation on Hegel's theory of free will, he then became an assistant professor of philosophy at Kenyon College, joining the Purdue faculty in 2009. His broad project is to develop a political theory that integrates the conceptual reaches of the Kantian theory of autonomy, free will, the phenomenological reaches of an expressivist theory of moral psychology, and the political reaches of concrete social and historical description. Hegel pursued a project of just this sort for his own time, turn of the 19th century Germany, and thus since his dissertation, Christopher's work has been primarily concerned with reconstructing Hegel's views. So the word is yours. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, and thank everybody for being here. There's a handout. I think everybody has it. Got some passages and a brief outline. What I'm going to say in lots of respects follows on Jean-Francois Kervagand's talk in Cusco and Luca and Max's talk today about social mediation between the individual and the state, or between the individual level and the political level, if you like. I'm going to be talking about Hegel's attempt to provide that mediation in his own social theory, which is essentially a theory of the estates, die Stände. So the title of the talk is Hegel on the social basis of the political, and the social here is really to be understood in terms of Hegel's estates theory. Let me step back a bit and say in terms of the conference title, Hegel and the Political. I think it's a good time to step back and wonder what that term political, what domain that sets out. In part because I do think it's remarkable that neither Kant, Fichte, or Hegel describe what they're doing as political philosophy, right? What they're doing is a philosophy of Recht, which is a very difficult term to translate into English. But it's not straightforwardly political philosophy, and it corresponds to an experience of lawmaking and authority that is not our own. Nonetheless, all three of these figures, and Hegel in particular, who I'm talking about today, are essentially writing, not at the beginning, maybe in the middle, of the great state-building period in the German-speaking lands. And so they are essentially intervening philosophically in a movement that came to establish the kind of states that we inhabit today by a long series of transformations, right? So in part, I think what's valuable about Kant, Fichte, Hegel, but particularly Hegel's political philosophy, or Reichsphilosophy, is a glimpse into a time when the state was not yet formed, when lots of political options were on the table. So in part, I come to this project, I really got engaged with this project because in teaching Axel Honneth's book, Freedom's Right, he makes this claim at the beginning that the problem with actualizing Hegel is he lived in this static and traditional society where as we live in these modern dynamic and changing societies. And I think that's entirely backwards. I think Hegel lived through more dramatic changes in social and political organization than any of us have, right? With perhaps the possible exception of those who lived in the DDR, right, and changes. But all of the options are on the table, and particularly as Hegel is writing in the Reform period, when the German lands are desperate to pay back their war reparations to France, nothing is too extreme as a possibility to be considered. And I think it's really important to approach their political philosophies with an understanding of this time and the kind of change that was going on. Another subtitle of my talk could be, what is the problem for which the estates are the solution in Hegel? Because, I won't go into details, but even in 1820, talking about die Stände had a somewhat archaic or traditionalist ring to it. Already in the 18th century, there was a lot of worry in Germany that the Stände were just a legal formalism and they did not correspond to social reality, right? That was a kind of common concern. And so I want to back up a little bit, not just talk about Hegel, and talk about what the problem is that in this Reform period, the estates Hegel thought were the solutions to. So I'm going to start with a couple of passages from a piece by Wilhelm von Humboldt, the Denkschrift über Preußens ständische Verfassung. A Denkschrift is a memorandum, I guess. So this memorandum was addressed to Staatsminister von Stein, and it was shared with Hardenberg and these other reformers in the Prussian bureaucratic circles. It was written in February 1819, so right about the time of the composition of Hegel's philosophy of right. And there's lots of echoes between the Denkschrift and things that Hegel says in the Grundlinien, which I'm not at all the first person to have recognized. In part of the state building process in this Reform period, it's important to recognize that the persona of the citizen, in a certain sense, is being created. The notion that there was something like a Staatsbürger, a citizen of a state, rather than a Stadtbürger, right, a citizen of a town, was controversial. Right? When members of the nobility were addressed as Staatsbürger, they totally objected to the characterization. Right? And so there's this process for which you have this lovely German phrase, fördern and fordern, right? Of both promoting and demanding a kind of citizenship from individuals. There's a parallel thing that's happening with legal standing and legal responsibility as well. But these are very much statuses that are being created at the time, rather than standing social relations that are being picked out as the most important thing. And so part of the goal is to realize this new kind of status. So here is the way Humboldt puts the goal. The goal is that the citizen, and this is the first quote on your handout. These are my translations, they're not beautiful, but I did it quickly, I apologize. The goal is that the citizen receives through participation in legislation, oversight, and administration more public spirit and ability, so that they become ethical for themselves and to give their industry and individual life a higher meaning, insofar as both are tied more closely to the welfare of their fellow citizens. Right? The goal is to induce a kind of citizenship of this kind, where there's an interest in the common good, where there's more than merely the particular interests of the growing bürgerliche Gesellschaft, the growing civil society. But how do you do this? And how do you encourage people to identify with something as big as Prussia or Bavaria, right? So that's the goal. And here's the problem, as Humboldt puts it. One hears now very often complaints that the people don't take enough interest in the objects of outer and inner politics, and the wish that this interest were more awoken, fanned, and maintained. But one can boldly claim that when this interest, as it is unfortunately present or wished for, is so general and without firm practical foundation, hangs in the air, so to speak, whether it must not be called damaging. And as this share is usually expressed, it lacks the most necessary condition, namely that it start with what is nearby, where direct contact with the circumstances makes actual insight and successful action possible, a point from which it can afterwards raise itself to the highest and more general, right? On the one hand, I won't say this, I'm not convinced that this is a problem that has left us, but it's a problem and the goal that I think have been relatively invisible to 20th and 21st century political philosophy. And I think there's two reasons for that. Number one, we tend to project back our own experience of the state onto earlier times. I mean, you have to imagine Prussia in 1800 is extraordinarily knowledgeable simply because they know how many people live in Prussia, right? Most states couldn't even tell you that, right? And this goes along with a kind of perennialist approach to political philosophy, where we take ourselves to be answering the same questions as Kant and Hegel and Aristotle and Thomas and so on. Like the Cambridge School, I reject that approach to political philosophy. I think political questions are historically specific. But as I hope to point out along the way, I don't think that that makes them archaic, these earlier experiences, because there's so many things that do come up again in historical development. Okay, so much for the goal and the problem. If you are looking for Hegel, you can see the goal in section 260 of the Grunlian and the problem in section 302, which Luca was just quoting earlier today. Hegel's solution to this problem is to build the estates into the state. And in fact, my stronger thesis is that the structure of the Hegelian state is simply an institutionalization of the estates. And I make one more linguistic remark here, which is just the difference between Stand and Staat in German, between estate and state, took a long time to figure out. And so well into the 18th century, the Latin status for state is translated as Stand into German. And it takes a while before people start translating it as Staat, as something different. So here's Hegel's solution. Build the estates into the state, on my account. So this is the remark to section 303. The idea that those communities which are already present in the circles referred to above, and he's referring back to his discussion of the estates and the corporation, the idea that those communities can be split up again into a collection of individuals as soon as they enter the sphere of politics, the sphere of the highest concrete universality, involves separating civil and political life from each other and leaves political life hanging, so to speak, in the air. For its basis is then merely the abstract individuality of arbitrary will and opinion, and is thus grounded only on contingency rather than on a foundation which is stable and legitimate in and for itself. So we come back to this thought, as when I'm teaching this stuff to my students, I always say, look, I know you think Hegel believes we can all have absolute knowledge, but he's also very humble about what he thinks we can know about the general good. And he thinks it's a really hard problem to go from your own personal experience to figuring out what's good for Prussia or what's good for Bavaria, right? Much the less what's good for the United States with 330 million people, right? This is a hard problem, right? And not everybody can do it, or at any rate, we should help people do it, right? And so the estates are ways to do this. So I'll move on to section 2. I think they do this in 3 basic ways. I think these 3 basic ways are all in Montesquieu, but I won't argue for that or the influence of Montesquieu on Hegel. But in case you're interested, the estates, first of all, functions as the preconditions for the validity of laws. They function as forms of local participation, and this is the part that's most directly connected to the Humboldt problem. And finally, to use a Montesquieuian term, they serve as a way of protecting moderate government. And I'm going to interpret this as Hegel's suggestion for what a modern political praxis would look like under conditions of real social division and disagreement. Right? This is section 2 on the handout to talk about the preconditions of validity. I think what Hegel is doing here is he is repurposing social distinctions so that the political norms that are being proposed belong to or feel like the citizen's own. So the first step in giving citizens this ability to rise to the level of the universal is to bring the universal down to their level and have it actually make contact with their lives and use categories and norms with which they are familiar so that the laws do not appear as an alien imposition, right? I mean, this is part of what I absolutely love about Montesquieu. He's so humane. And Montesquieu is always concerned that if you have written laws that are too different from the social norms, right, you're in a bad situation. And you cannot save the legitimacy of your written laws under those conditions, right? The history always wins for Montesquieu, right? I think this is Hegel in a way responding in his own time to the question I asked Luca, to which Luca responded, we don't have words yet, right? And Max was echoing this too. We need new concepts for the kinds of social mediating structures that we're talking about. And I do think it's very important that Hegel is quite consciously using the notion of a Stand, right? So Fichte had already argued that we should move from Stand to Klasse. Get rid of the Stand, right? Start thinking about classes. Now, what's weird for Fichte in the geschlossene Handelsstaat is the classes look like guilds in their own way, right? It's not a very modern conception of class. But in any event, Hegel is quite consciously using this apparently archaic notion to reconstruct his social theory. But what can also be hard to see is what Hegel's doing with the notion. So Hegel's estates are not the traditional Landstände that Germans talked about, as it was sometimes put in the slogan, the Lehr-, Wehr- und Nährstände, right? The learned estate of the clergy, the fighting estate of the nobility, and the nutritive estate, right, of the peasantry who grow things, right? Hegel's estate structure is quite different. It's proto-Marxist in the sense that it's built on the mode of production, right? You have an agricultural estate, you have an estate that produces things for the market, he calls it the Stand des Gewerbes, and you have a public estate, right? So the clergy and the new bureaucracy and doctors have all been grouped together in this public estate. Town citizens have been replaced by the Stand des Gewerbes, anybody, wherever they are, who works to produce things for the market. And perhaps most significantly, the nobility and the peasantry get swept into one estate together, namely the agricultural estate, right? Hegel makes arguments that anybody who works the land and is tied to it in a distinctive way has the honorific features that have been traditionally attributed to the nobility. So this is Hegel's way of trying to do what Montesquieu who said that laws should be adapted to the people for whom they are framed. But Hegel already sees there's not just one people, the Germans. There's 3 different kinds of people. There's 3 different kinds of life here. And they've got to be adapted in different ways. And so even though Hegel generally thinks philosophy can't tell you about particular positive laws, doesn't say what the penalty for things ought to be, except for murder has the death penalty and so on. The 2 exceptions that I know of where he speaks of have to do with divorce law and inheritance law. And I'll just talk about the inheritance law. Hegel says that agricultural property, farms, should be, as he puts it, burdened with Majorat. In English we say primogeniture, which simply means the farm passes in its entirety to the firstborn son. Hegel doesn't particularly care about the firstborn son part, except that it makes it clear who gets it. But he really cares about the farm staying together, because a farm as a whole supports a family, provides independence, and keeps people from falling into rural poverty. But that's a constraint on property for the agricultural estate that Hegel thinks does not apply to property for the productive estate, the estate that's providing, producing things for market. Another example, this isn't very specific, but Hegel says in the Philosophy of Right that for the agricultural estate, you need to keep the laws simple and stable, right? You're dealing with a largely illiterate population. Things can't change too frequently, and they cannot be difficult to understand. The Standesgewerbes, on the other hand, those are litigious people, right? I mean, you can, as far as Hegel is concerned, you can make your regulations as definite as you like about them, right? But that you have to, as it were, the first thing, if you're trying to bring people up to the state, is to bring the state down to them, right? And the estate structure is the kind of typology that Hegel uses to figure out how to make that work. All right, so that's the first function of the estates, preconditions of validity. The second, and this is most directly connected to Humboldt's issue, is thinking of them as forms of local participation, right? So in the absence, Hegel thinks, of direct insight into the universal significance of particular actions or policies, the possibility of understanding that significance relies on public practices of interpreting shared norms. We can't go from nothing to the state, from my own personal experience to the state in one go. It's got to be that we've got local practices of interpretation and discussion that allow us to elevate things above, right? So here's how Hegel puts it. In our modern states, the citizens have only a limited share in the universal business of the state. But it is necessary to provide ethical man with a universal activity in addition to his private end. This universal, which the modern state does not always offer him, can be found in the corporation. We saw earlier that in providing for himself, the individual in society is also acting for others. This is Hegel's argument in civil society, that there's a lot more universality going on than people own up to. But this unconscious necessity is not enough. Only in the corporation does it become a knowing and thinking ethical life, right? Hegel uses a bunch of terms for talking about this in these intermediate local levels: Kooperation, Stand. Humboldt has a number of phrases that he uses. He talks about Bürgervereine, he talks about Genossenschaften, talks about ständische Behörden. In my favorite turn of phrase, he talks about the Staatsgemeinschaft, which, you know, for us, not after Tony's distinction between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, has a very strange ring to it. But Humboldt means by that precisely a community of the state, something local that's less formalizable, right? But that involves people in a kind of administration, even at the local level, and a kind of leadership. And Humboldt in particular says, those are the people that you want to be elected into your estate's assembly. You want these people who are already running some kind of Bürgerverein, right? In Germany, you have all of these groups with AV, right? Eingetragener Verein, right? I mean, even my mountain bike club in Munich was an Eingetragener Verein, right? But Hegel's point is, like, you want somebody who had to make a motion and say, we're going to raise dues because we need to do this, and has a plan for it. Like, those are the kinds of people, even, right, I mean, what's the Munich mountain bike club, 50 people or something like that. That's already something more than somebody who's just sitting in the bar drinking beer, right, talking nonsense, right, or watching, you know, pick your TV program for the day, right? So I do think this is really important for Hegel. And I also want to emphasize, he mainly talks about this with respect to civil society, that he uses Kooperation in a very broad way to include the kinds of local government structures that Prussia was trying to build out. I mean, civil society has come to be primarily economic to us, but for Hegel, it is simply the realm of voluntary associations. So it still has a little bit of that Enlightenment ring, right, about the lodges and the coffee houses and so on, even if Hegel already sees the economization of it that's coming, right? But all of these local relationships are supposed to produce people who have already moved a little bit, right? And can therefore mediate, right? Can therefore think about what other people in their position are needing, and so that they can talk at the estate's assembly level, but also can take laws and results from the estate's assembly level and explain it to their own people in a way that they can hear, right? In a way that they can understand. So that again, it's supposed to make the law feel like it's their own, essentially. So Humboldt is particularly interested in how you make law giving and administration more successful, or at least that's the way he pitches the idea to Stein. And so he's particularly interested in how it moves up. The other thing that he says you have to give these local Bürgervereine and so on is das Recht der Beschwerdeführung. I think it's something like the right to complain, right? The right to raise grievances and bring them up, right? You don't want that to be direct either. You want somebody who's the head of that Verein to exercise some judgment about what are reasonable complaints and what are unreasonable complaints. And from above, to help give you a suggestion of how to address them, and so on, right? So all of these kind of intermediate bodies. I do think that there's a kind of limit case here, which is the conservative agricultural state. Hegel always describes the agricultural state as conservative. I think here the best way to understand Hegel's statements about the agricultural estate is in terms of Fichte's notion of the summons to be free. If any of you know the Aufforderung in Fichte's Foundations, it's the solution to a particular problem in Fichte that maybe in a way has its roots in Rousseau. The Rousseauian way of putting it is, how do you force people to be free? The Fichtean way of putting it is, how do you cause people to be free when freedom is freedom from causation, right? That's this problem that Fichte has. How do you produce free people in a way, right? It's a very abstract representation of this political problem that's going on, right? And Fichte's ingenious solution is, I summon you to be responsible. Now look, you can always say, no, I'm not responsible. Aha, but I've got you, that's a free act, right? So it's a kind of request that can't be refused. And it's fascinating, the educated nobility understood what was going on. And they understood that they were being dragged into a space of reasons, to use Seller's phrase, that was inhospitable to them. And Frederick Beiser is very good on it. The whole notion of conservatism only develops in this case. It's only once the nobility is dragged into the space of reasons that somebody articulates that tradition is a reason, right? But the educated nobility understood they were on the back foot, right? They were fighting at a disadvantage here. But Hegel thinks you can make that, as we now say, a feature, not a bug. You can turn that to your advantage rather than to your disadvantage. And the way you do that is by making it endogenous to the state, inside the state. So let me go to the third part, protection of moderate government. the thing that the estate structure of the state is supposed to do, it's supposed to make social tension politically productive. It's supposed to make social disagreement the way that you pass laws, right? I think this is Hegel's proposal for a modern political praxis, for a political praxis in a society that is deeply divided, where people have a hard time seeing each other as co-citizens, of understanding how they're really the same, right? Lots of people in the new productive and voluntary civil society felt like they had far more in common, Germans in this, felt like they had far more in common with the English than with the Prussian peasantry, right? And reformers in particular, there's lots of funny movies about this, right? Reformers are always sent out into the rural areas only to have the peasants cleverly, right, undermine all of their efforts. For what it's worth, if you're interested in this, Christian Gave has this fantastic book. It's got a super long title, but Über der Charakter des Bauern, around the character of the peasants and their relations to the manorial lord and the government, right? But Hegel thinks you can bring this into the state and make it actually a stabilizing moment of the state. Because the other thing that you're going to bring into the state, and this is what I was saying to Thomas yesterday, is you're going to bring the revolutionary impulse of civil society, you're going to make that endogenous to the state too. And then you're going to charge the public estate with mediating between these two bickering factions and producing actual policies that can be implemented. This works in a whole bunch of different ways, or I would say in a whole bunch of different registers. So that's why you have this beautiful table in front of you, as some of you have seen talk by me before, know that I love tables. I think the extent to which Hegel sees the estates as interlocked cannot be overstated. And it happens at a whole bunch of different registers. And about every 6 months, I think I discover another level of what's going on here in Hegel. And I think it's ingenious. So as I have across the top right, each estate can be distinguished logically. It can be distinguished with respect to the speed or pace of change that it is comfortable with. It can be distinguished with respect to its temporal orientation. Using terms from the German historian Reinhard Koselleck, you can characterize them as encapsulating different aspects of the expanded present. They are each given, as it were, particular institutions that they're primarily identified with. And then within the state, they each get a part of the state, right? So we'll just go from left to right, as it were, right? There's more, right? I mean, I could talk about the forms of agency in the morality chapter of the philosophy of right and how those are attributed to them too. But in each of these ways, what's important about the table is each of these three things hangs together on Hegel's account. And so he thinks if you can find real social groups that embody these differences, they also embody these relations. And then you can have a real mediating structure and keep the conversation going. So I'll just briefly talk about the table and then I'll stop because I want to be sure we have plenty of time for questions. Maybe I'll just read the layout of this top. Hegel thinks of the agricultural estate as being deeply bound to the particularities of time and place, and all of the extraordinary variety of rural relations, right? We talk about serfdom, for example, but there's lots of different German words for serfdom that look different from one valley to the next. You can make some generalizations, but the diffuse and varied nature of world social relations is pretty extraordinary, right? At the same time, it's essentially inertial, right? On Friday in Buenos Aires, I will read a wonderful quote from the French historian Fernand Braudel, talking about what he calls material civilization, right? Traditional civilization, where he thinks the past greedily swallows up lifetimes of men as people just do exactly what their parents did and their grandparents did and so on, right? It essentially reaches back to the past, right? The political vocabulary is traditionalist, right? And brings those meanings to bear. It is in this way, if we're talking about the present, the past made present, right? What Koselleck calls the Erfahrungsraum, or the space of experience. Hegel also thinks it's in the agricultural estate that the family is most important, because it's in the agricultural estate that the family is also an economic unit, right? Not merely a personal unit. It's, if you like, a Hausstand, not merely a familia. And this inertial, particular, traditionalist estate gets the lower house of the Estates Assembly, right? I call it the business estate. I don't really know how to translate Standesgewerbes. I think Dickey says a state of trade and industry. I mean, Hegel distinguishes between three different kinds. People, handicrafts, craftspeople, Handwerker, yeah. People who work in factories, Fabrik is factory, not industry. I steered you wrong earlier today. And the Handelsstand, the merchant estate, people who buy and sell and take things, right? This is maybe not so clear in the text, but I'm perfectly happy to talk about that in Q&A. I think he thinks logically these are the people of the formal universal. These are the people who are most adamant about their rights, who are most adamant about money as a measure of all things, who care the least about the particularities of time and place, and who are, in a certain sense, the least rooted in the social dimension of the state, right? They're accelerationists and aimed at the future, right? The capitalism cannot get here fast enough. We cannot get rid of traditional restrictions on production fast enough, right? No plan of the reformers is radical enough as far as this estate is concerned. They represent the horizon of expectation, which Koselleck thinks of as the future made present, right? It's the future that's so close, it seems necessary. You can almost touch it, right? But it remains in the future. There's a funny Khrushchev joke behind that. That would be a digression, right? They get civil society, right? Perhaps most obviously. And then you get the upper house of the state. So the Estates Assembly is this inertial agricultural estate, right? And this accelerationist estate of business, right? And they're opening up this tension. And it is the responsibility of the public estate to get these people talking to each other, to meld them together into an individual at a moderate pace that nobody's going to be entirely happy with. In the present, right? The public estate is the estate of the 5-year plan. It's the political action that's supposed to, in a certain sense, take you from the past to the future. And they already get the state. And so on Hegel's view, these folks don't have a role to play in the Estates Assembly. They don't get to vote in the Estates Assembly. They don't get representatives in the Estates Assembly, and they cannot be representatives in the Estates Assembly. I would just notice this is really important because in a lot of the early 19th century Estates Assemblies in various parts of Germany, you would have a situation where the majority were civil servants. They were actually they were supposed to be representing civil society, but they were simultaneously drawing a salary from the state. And there was lots of complaints in early 19th century Germany about this situation. And so Hegel essentially thinks, these people, they have enough power, right? They're essentially writing the laws that people are debating. right? And they're the ones, as it were, on the ground in the Polizei actually making this stuff happen. I'll just say one more thing, and then turn it over, which is, I can't resist saying that this is also straight Montesquieu, as far as I can tell. In the United States, nobody reads Montesquieu anymore, but when they know anything about Montesquieu, they know about the separation of powers from the Federalist Papers. But what everybody forgets is that Montesquieu said it's not enough to just have different institutions. You have to have different social groups in charge of those different institutions, otherwise all is lost. You haven't actually gotten any benefit. And I think Hegel tried to learn that lesson and build this kind of differentiation into the state through the estate structure. Okay, I talked too long. I should go.
So thank you, Professor Yeomans. We have 13 minutes for discussion.
Sorry.
So we already had one question, Professor Dieter.
Yeah.
One question, how can you connect business or civil society with universal?
Yes.
We know in Hegel this is the sphere of Verstand.
Yes.
Der Verstandesallgemeinheit.
Yeah.
And you cannot use universal, sorry.
Well, so, I mean, look, I mentioned this already. It's even worse. There's another thing you could say, which is when Hegel introduces the public estate, he calls it the Allgemeine Stand, right? But I think if you dig into all of the texts and the relation, and you're trying to find the threefold relation of particular, universal, and individual there, it makes most sense to attribute the universality to civil society and the business estate, and individuality to the state. Now, I grant you, it's an abstract form of universality, but individuality for Hegel has to do with effectiveness and totality, and those are all features of the state, not features of civil society. So I agree that I've got some text to explain away, but I think, you know, if I were to give you a whole bunch of different texts, I think the balance of it supports this kind of taxonomy.
Professor Literaci?
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. It's very useful, this kind of reading, because it is historical grounded, so to say, and it is very useful. At the beginning, you spoke about the difficulty to translate laws of right, laws of law, or political philosophy. And my question is, where is the space for politics in this articulation? Is politics proper for public state, or is politics that way that connect all the three, and not only the two one, agriculture and business, that is the question of public. Where is the space of politics in your opinion here?
Yes. It is easiest to see, I think, interestingly, in the corporations of civil society. Because there, Hegel thinks, you're talking about voluntary associations where people have to lead and persuade and convince others to carry out a common task and to have a common purpose. And so he is most explicit about the corporations of civil society producing that kind of mediating effect for that reason. He also thinks that it is present in the bureaucracy. This is harder for us to see, right? We are inclined to contrast, as you were contrasting, the administrative state and the political state, right? I I remember getting to Germany for my sabbatical in 2016, right before the Trump election. And Germans complaining that they didn't have any politics, they only had Verwaltung. And they wish they had American politics. And I said, be careful what you wish for, right? And then in November, we got Trump. But in the period at the time, pieces like Humboldt's Denkschrift are really important, almost as political manifestos and contributions. And what is being done by Stein and Hardenberg is nothing less than reimagining what Prussia could look like under modern conditions. How French could it be, right, among other things? What would the laws look like? How could you build out state courts? All of these are just as much political as they are administrative, right? And so I think when we think of an administrative apparatus now, we think of something with clearly defined authority, having been directed by a kind of legislation, with a certain kind of funding model and so on. All of that's up in the air. And so the decisions that they're making are essentially constitutional decisions that would have far-reaching ramifications. And there's a lot of dilemmas involved. So there's a lot of very practical politics involved. What's harder to see, I remember Zdravko pushing back against me on this, is how it works for the agricultural estate, right? Whether this is really going to be the politics that Hegel and lots of the reformers, particularly Stein, who's a little bit more utopian, not utopian, but radical than Hardenberg, is the hope that what you could develop is a rural society of small family farms, rather than a rural society of Junker manorial lords, and whether you called them serfs or sharecroppers or hired labor, they were worried it wouldn't really make much of a difference, right? The hope was you would build out all of these family farms, and those people would be independent, and they would have local Vereine, right? In the United States in the 19th century, farmers developed these things called granges, which are like farmers' co-ops. You can still see the buildings dotting rural Midwestern America. But I think Hegel thinks at that level, right? Or even, to go back to the estate obtained industry, within an industry, right? That all of the, weavers have an elected representative or a council of weavers or something like that. That's already politics, I think, is what I think Hegel thinks. And then you can build up from that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So we can make it the last round of questions, and
Sorry.
then you answer
Yeah.
once. So please here, then you, and you. Anyone else? So I have two questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I was thinking about this idea of construction of the notion of persona, to begin with this,
Yeah.
you know, in Hegel has a so important thing, or case, you know.
Yeah.
And I was thinking on how much difficulty it implies the place that in German has the expression of Bürger, you know, because Bürger is used in German in an economic sense, and at the same time in a political sense. And so this makes it very difficult to make the distinction between the strictly political expression that we find in French citoyen or in English citizen, you know,
Yeah.
a strictly political sense, separated from the idea of bourgeois that you have in French as in English, that has a distinctly economic sense, you know.
Yeah.
So, do you think this lexical problem is playing its role some way and somehow?
Yes. Well,
Maybe we
right.
do all
Okay.
together. Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. So,
Yeah, I would like to give you thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I'm looking at this table, for example. I'm taking the case of South America, in particular Chile, as a political arrangement. I will say that the agricultural is not so separated from the business side,
Yes.
and the business has actually this inertial aspect as oligarchies, you know.
Yeah.
Will that for Hegel be just an erroneous form of state arrangement? What role will the public fulfill? Will the public go like the business type, like as an directionist? Or what would you think about this intertwined two aspects, in particular in South America and Chile?
Yeah.
okay. I'm sorry.
No, there's another.
No, no, no,
Yeah,
no,
okay.
Sorry. Please,
Yes,
short
it's probably a
and-
fair question. You're talking, thank you for your talk. It reminded me of Tocqueville's, what he says about the role of the juries in democracy in America. So I just want to know if there's something near to that, like with the judges being like this link or this mediating element in Hegel.
Yeah. Let me go in reverse order. The juries, Hegel insists that juries be standesgemäß, that I be judged by a jury of people from my estate. That's a part of the judgment being rendered to me in terms that make it comprehensible that the law is my own, Hegel thinks. He insists on that. And so I think it's exactly that, that point put in a theory of the estates, right? Hey, lots of other places too. I'll just say one more thing. Hegel says about debts and bankruptcy that the debtor can take anything from you, but can't take from you what's required for you to be a member of your Stand. So in particular, he mentions like a worker's tools. Like the creditor can't take a worker's tools. But the social persona, the legal persona is according to one's estate. Chile, I don't know very much. Here's what I will say. Maybe I would put it this way. You get less necessary as you move from left to right. It becomes more contingent. So I think Hegel thinks it's absolutely necessary that a society have a universal, a particular, and an individual aspect. That's a logical result. I sometimes think he thinks he's got a further argument that the particular is always going to be inertial and so on the time. But who that would be, the estates, I think, is not at all determined by any kind of logic. And so I'm often in the real philosophy oriented by a remark that Hegel makes in the philosophy of nature, where he says, we know the rational is to be found irgendwo in nature. Like, we know what we're looking for and that we'll find it there, but where exactly, right? Is it the frog or the solar system or something? That you gotta just figure out and interpret. So all of this is supposed to just be a framework for a political hermeneutics. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it would be quite different in us today, right? There's lots of ways, so I don't know Chile, but in the United States in which the rural population is very radical, right? There's this weird way in which like now Democrats are the conservatives and Republicans are the radicals now, and particularly around guns and the relation to state authority. So that I just think of as Hegel's political hermeneutics. This gives you a framework for trying to understand. So if you were to do this today, you would need new vocabulary. We're not going to be able to use the vocabulary of the Stande. But you know, you could do the sociology, and this would guide the sociology in a, Hegel thinks, productive way, right? It's really, it's a really interesting question about Berger. I was saying with respect to Max's talk that there's a, what we want is a Versittlichung, not a Wirtschaftlichung, as it were, right? Can you say that in German? Verwirtschaftlichung? Yeah. Look, civil society at this time is still both the new free market economies and the Enlightenment institutions. I mean, Habermas is actually quite good about the structural transformation of the public sphere, I think. That intellectual side gets stripped out of it. And civil society starts to look just economic, right? There's still times when we use it to mean something more than that. After 1989, right? The idea that the former Soviet states needed to reestablish a civil society was a common notion that was tossed around. And there, it's clearly not merely the economic sense, but also the social, the ethical sense. I think what Hegel's arguing in this situation, in the system of needs, is that the free market is a lot less atomistic than its supporters think it is. And though it thinks of itself as the realm of pure particularity, in fact, it develops these systems of need. Because in fact, number one, people aren't all that different. All gotta eat, right? And so on. And number two, you've got to find a lingua franca so that you can exchange. You've got to have something like money, you've got to have common norms and so on. So I think Hegel thinks, to use this English idiom again, that this feature of the term Bürger is a feature, not a bug. That it can show the way in which economic agency is already political agency, maybe unrecognized. I mean, yeah. That's
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Thank you.